artwork at the same time.
Yeah. Well, that works. All right. So we are live. We've been live for 8 seconds now. Didn't hurt a bit, did it?
No, it did not.
I'm Mac McCullough. I am a librarian here at Willard Library, where we have perpetual sunsets, at least on the virtual screen behind me. And my guest today is Jennie HeplerTakens, who is a local artist, a art doll maker, and a Halloween artist, and also the organizer of the Bewitching Peddlers of Halloween show exhibit that's happening in September. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But Jennie, thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here with you.
Yeah, and we've talked a couple of times now, and I don't even know where to start. But maybe we could start with, as I've gotten to know your work a little bit better, the term Halloween artist doesn't seem to do it justice, nor does necessarily art doll making. Not to disparage any of those labels, but tell me about
So,
those labels and
yeah,
tell me
so
about you.
labels are really tough. I am a full-time Halloween doll maker or art doll artist. That's what I do, but it's really so much more. Like in the past, when I've tried to show my work at galleries, they really don't like doll maker or art doll. They really prefer figurative sculpture or sculpture. Um, and it's tried and true. Like I've tried to put my work out there as art doll, and galleries have really said no thank you. And then I've put my work out there as sculpture, and people are like, yes, please. I mean, even like the same galleries, like a couple years apart. So I really feel like doll maker kind of makes you think of women's work, and women's work isn't really valued that much in our society.
Mhm.
And so, really, when I'm writing up bios and when I'm telling people what I do, I say narrative sculptor because I do tell a story with my pieces. So it's difficult where to kind of classify what I do.
Sure. Well, I don't know who's watching necessarily. You know, doll making may conjure up one thing in some person's mind, but to know your work, I think that they might be surprised when they see the two things together.
Mhm.
But you used a phrase that I thought was really cool. You called yourself a narrative sculpt. You do narrative sculpture.
Mhm.
Talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to get into your art pretty quickly because I want folks to see it.
Sure. So I do create a narrative with the piece. Like sometimes when I'm making a piece, I feel like the piece is the story. Like the piece tells a story. I created a turnip lady, and her body is like a bookshelf, and she has a whole story of why her body is the bookshelf. And she is a narrative. She has her own story. But other pieces are like a moment of a story. The characters just kind of walking through the story. And other artists prefer to make the piece and let the work let you figure out the story. But really, I mean, I get so wrapped up in the pieces that I love creating a backstory, or I love folklore and fairy tales and witchy stories, and I like to kind of infuse my work with like little bits of folklore, or like how I would retell the story if it was my story.
But sometimes people draw their own stories, right?
Yeah, completely. Completely.
And you invite that.
I invite that,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
I can't always make up a story for every single piece, and I've done the show, and then I've been contacted afterwards by someone saying, does this piece have a story, or can you make up a story for this piece? And that's always fun too, because I want people to connect with a piece, and they can either do that through the story or through the piece.
Our first comment, Dennis Otis. You are absolutely magical, Jen.
Aw, thanks.
And you work. Well, let's jump into your art a little bit, and then we can get into your backstory a little bit. I get the magic of presentation. Why don't you talk about this piece and the story behind it if you can?
Okay, sure. So, one of my favorite folklore stories is that of Baba Yaga. Um, she is all through Eastern European folklore, and so she's a mainly like a Slavic story. So she's presented as the in the crone phase. So there's maiden, mother, and crone. So she's always presented as an old woman, and most of the time she has like teeth of metal, or she kind of lures children, like a Hansel and Gretel type of a story. She lures children into her stove to cook them, or kind of a darker story. And she's represented by a house with chicken legs. Um, and I've always been fascinated with Baba Yaga, and so I started learning more about her. And she's really the keeper of the realm from beyond, like the next realm. So the dead will come to her, and she will prepare them for their transition phase, and she will kind of welcome them. So it really made me think that's beautiful, and that's not the metal teeth and cooking children. And it really made me think, well, how many other stories are cautionary tales of staying away from the wise women in our society and culture? um, and and it really brought me, with the story of this particular piece, it brought me to the idea that um, like healed women are harder to control, you
Hmm.
know. And so I feel like Baba Yaga is a very healing type of a um, character or witch, or folklore story. And I really connected with that idea of of her bringing healing and not wounds.
Yeah, yeah. This is just a close up of the same piece. But
Mhm.
what do you work with? What did you
So
work with this?
I surround myself with vintage pieces. I really don't buy anything new. Um, I think the older the piece, the piece then is bringing its own bits of story. Like I use Victorian garments and like Titanic era dresses that are beyond repair. I just take them completely apart and use them for the garments on my dresses. And um, I use cloth and clay and paper mache. And so, being, what I do, a down maker or a narrative sculptor, I sew, I sculpt, I forage, I tell the story. It's really, the best of each art area.
Yeah.
So this piece is in the hosta garden. I do pumpkins that are kind of non-traditional in color. I do, pink pumpkins, purple, traditional orange pumpkins, greens, blues. Um, I think that the oddity pumpkins kind of connect with people who may not really be into Halloween, but they just really like an odd little character. Um, and this one really, the purples really resonated with my hostas, and I've recently become a hosta gardener, and so I try
Mhm.
and photograph all of my pieces in our garden.
Is there a story behind this piece?
Not really. This one is really special because of her garment. That is, I'm not sure who she went to live with after she sold, but that garment was like a vaudeville performer's costume. And I kept it for over 10 years before I decided to cut into it and finally make a costume out of it. Um,
Wow.
that's the thing. I find these wonderful pieces and I source these fabulous elements to work with, and then they're too precious to cut into. And I end up just, I'm a keeper of things over time.
I would like to see your inventory, I think.
It's my whole entire house. And this is the turnip lady. And I made all of the little books that you see in her bookshelf. Um, and her complete story is on my website. It's really a kind of long story, but her stem part up here is all hand sculpted with paper mache, and her body is cloth and clay, and then her the bodice is cloth and clay, but the body is like an antique children's dresser, and I turned it into a bookshelf.
Hmm. That's wild. And I put your website up there for a minute.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's lots of stories that go with each piece, each one on there. And this is more of a traditional pumpkin, with lots of bits and pieces. I have a really hard time when I have these really fancy pieces of fabric of throwing anything out. It's just all too hard to come by and too precious. And so, I have little baskets and bins, and it's all filled with little scraps, and you never know when
Hmm.
it's just gonna speak to me, and I'm gonna, base a piece completely around a little scrap.
Yeah.
Um, so the special thing about this piece is the eyes. My husband, Joe Takens, was a glass blower, and he made the eyes for that piece. He made lots of hand-blown glass eyes for my pieces. So this is another really fun piece in color. It's very non-traditional, and this was really fun. I debuted this piece at the last Bewitching Peddlers of Halloween show, and people were kind of shocked at the vibrancy of that color of a pumpkin, and it really took people's hearts. And I think I think it went home with Halloween collector Amy Schneider, and she lives in Ohio. She's a big supporter of Halloween artwork.
Hmm. Yeah. So, and I just put up a scrab of your website,
Okay.
mydearestwitch.com.
Mhm.
Tell us about the name of that.
So, I worked under a different name for a very long time, and my husband always called me dearest, and I would just come up with these crazy ideas like, let's build an entire booth that's like a house for the show, and he would say, dearest, we can't do everything. Like, you just because you dream it up doesn't mean that, and he would just and so sometimes it was funny and sometimes it was in exasperation. He would call me dearest all the time. And so, and then my love of all Halloween and witchy things, I put dearest witch together. Yeah, just kind of a sentimentalist name.
Yeah. And before that, you used the name Prim Pumpkin, right?
Prim pumpkin, yeah.
So, tell us, how did this all begin for you? Where did it where did it start? How did you follow this path?
So I've always been a maker, and I've had to take breaks in my making for life stuff. But I've always kind of come back to making. My grandmother was a huge source of inspiration in my life, and um, she would hand sew garments. And I remember, sitting at her feet, and she would tell me a real good seamstress can sew like 21 stitches in an inch. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's a lot. I could never live up to that. So I moved on and did something else because I knew I couldn't do good at that. So, um, yeah, so I collected stories all through my life, and then um, finally I picked up a book on making cloth and clay dolls, and I tried my hand at it, and it seemed like something that I could do. But Joe and I were just recently married, and he was like a huge source of inspiration and like confidence building. Like never really had anyone in my life up until that point that um, like made me feel like it was worthy of doing, or that I was worthy of encouragement. So, I was so kind of that was like the building up that I needed,
Yeah.
to kind of step off on my own. And So yeah, he was like a huge fan of my work and of my life, and he made me feel real great about that. And so I just kept working and working and working and showing up and learning and, um, just figuring out trial and error. So I've been doing this for quite a while now, and I've tried gallery shows and website selling and a lot of different means of putting my work out there. And I feel like at this point in my life, creating less pieces, but more inspired pieces, that's the most important thing to me right now.
Sure. And before you really jumped in with both feet into artists, you were working in retail display, right?
Yeah, I worked at Macy's for a long time. A lot of artists that do what I do have that same background, and it's always cool to hear people talk about, "Oh, I was a window dresser at Macy's." Well, that's exactly what I did too. And um, so I learned about mannequins and how to build something from nothing and how to build in large scale. And I was able to travel to the Mall of America, different malls all across the United States, and build their window displays. And that was kind of a dream. When I was a kid, I watched. Do you remember the movie Mannequin?
Yeah.
Like I fell in love with the movie Mannequin, and then I'm like, I'm doing this, and then I one night at Macy's, I was working late, changing the mannequins' clothes all out. Mannequins are laying on the ground all over the place, and I'm thinking, this is gonna prepare me for motherhood, like changing kids' clothes, like all the like arms and legs, and but it turned out that after I had my own children, dressing mannequins was much easier because you can remove their arms and legs completely.
What a great invention that would be. No.
Right? So
But
yeah,
it was your children that actually kind of inspired you to, like, leave that world, right?
yeah, yeah, travel just didn't work out anymore for my life, and, ultimately, childcare ended up being, way too expensive to work and not be home with my kids, which is ultimately what I wanted to do is be home, and be a present parent with them, um, so yeah, that's down making has allowed me to be more present with them than I probably would have been able to otherwise.
And more present with your creative self too.
Exactly. And that's kind of more present with my creative self is like my goal. Um, because what I'm figuring out is, as you grow, your identity is attached to so many different things, like your job or your kids or other things that in the end, when all those things are peeled back, um, who are you? Why do you do what you do? What is your purpose? And that's what I'm figuring out is really important to know now.
Yeah. When you think back, um, when you what do you know now that you wish you knew when you started down this path?
Hmm.
For the benefit of those who are thinking about embarking on their own path.
So I would say this. I would say find somebody's work that you really like and that you admire how they market and how they do what they do and follow everything that they do. Um, try and talk to them about their process. See if they will give you tidbits. Like um, a lot of people, if somebody copies their work or if somebody does something too similar, they really become very unhappy. Um, but I think we all start somewhere, and I think if you if you kind of start out, you don't have your own style yet, but you start out looking at someone that you admires work, their work, and you do that for a while, and then your own style kind of just blooms out. I think it's important to always give artists credit if you're inspired by their work. Say, this is a pumpkin inspired by Jennie Hepler-Takens. Don't just copy somebody's work and say it's mine and here it is for sale. It's nice to give credit if you're inspired, but really look at somebody you admire and see what path they're taking and see what they have their fingers into, see materials they're working with, and what paintbrushes they like, and what materials they're having success with.
Who are some of your inspirations?
Um, Hands down, Scott Smith. He's a sculptor working out of Kalamazoo, Michigan, and he's the best of the best. He's absolutely magical and wonderful. Um, I love Lorena Williamson's work. She's a textile artist, and the pieces that she dreams up with vintage scraps and like 100-year-old fabric is absolutely exquisite. Um, yeah, I'm inspired by so many people's work. Everybody in the show, I mean, they're the best of the best. Kimberly Sherrod is an artist from Florida that I really love. Like, we're always on the same wavelength. Like, she's reading Emily Dickinson and I'm reading Emily Dickinson at the same time, and we're both, texting or sending messenger messages back and forth. And I'm like, reading Emily Dickinson is like laying your arm out on the table and cutting it, and the blood writes the poem. It's just so it's just so inspirational and like dark. And she's like, I know. And so she makes a lot of textile pieces. So she will make a coat out of a quilt, and she'll put Emily Dickinson quotes all over it, or writings. And so we each can see something and translate that into our work in a completely different way. I might sculpt something and she will stitch, and somebody else will make glass art or pottery. So it's just neat to inspire each other.
Yeah. Now, you just used the word dark. Even though some of the subject matter that you pick up in your art might be labeled as dark, it doesn't really would you consider yourself in dark
Well,
territory?
well, I do, because I'm deeply inspired by dark things, but when it goes through my lens and it comes out my fingertips, it's not dark. Like, it's sweet and fun and playful and whimsical and odd, but it's not necessarily dark. But I really do like dark stories, and you know, I love listening to I don't know, are you familiar with Daniel Handler,
Mhm.
Lemony Snicket?
Oh, yeah.
So I love listening to him, because he's always like, he writes he writes adult literature too, but he really hones in on children's literature. And he'll say, people will ask him questions like, how did you come up with series of unfortunate events? And he would say, I would think of the very worst thing that could happen, and then the next very worst thing that could happen, and then the next very worst thing. And I always get, that inspires me. And Neil Gaiman's work, and yeah, I love how, the very worst thing he can think of at that given time, isn't horrible, but to somebody it might be.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about the first piece that we put up, and pronounce it for me again, the
Well, Baba Yaga.
Baba Yaga. Thank you.
Mhm.
I mean, that has its origins in what we consider a dark story, cooking children.
Okay.
But you found something deeper in there, and you told me something when we met last week about another piece, that really kinda turned the, story of Little Red Riding Hood on its head. Talk about that a little bit.
Well,
Seeing it through the wolf's perspective.
yeah, so, I was creating a piece a couple years ago, and um, I always thought of the wolf as a very feminine creature, not a masculine hunter, really. And so when I started creating my wolf sculpture, I was thinking about the perspective of, what if the wolf was there to protect in a feminine way in the forest? And what if Little Red Riding Hood was the cantankerous, child that, wielded an axe and went after the grandmother? I mean, what if it was completely different than what we thought? And I think all of those stories are cautionary tales to get us to not do something. So don't go into the woods. Don't walk by yourself, like don't carry pastries alone, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So when I created the wolf piece, she turned out very feminine and very beautiful, and she had an axe in her heart. Um, she was a piece that I really connected with at that time because, you know, it made me feel the protection, like how I feel over my children, kind of, and how maybe it's the people that can be the worst in stories and not necessarily the animal, the blood dripping teeth animals that are painted for us.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, this has been a really often difficult time for many of us,
Yeah.
working through the pandemic. And you lost your husband when?
2.5 years ago, almost 3, yeah.
Yeah. And so we talked a little bit about working through, upheaval, grief, and
Yeah.
how's that been? How's that affected your art?
So it's affected my art greatly because, I lost my mom right before I lost my husband. Her passing was very sudden, and then his was lung cancer, and I had only like 3 months, and I really didn't understand what was happening, that he wasn't going to recover. Um, and we have 2 children, and so I really just kept working and working and working, and it really brought a realization to me of how our society embraces or doesn't embrace death and dying and grief and loss, and I really kind of turned that right into my work, and, I started, picking up any books that I could find about death and dying and grief and working through things. And do you work through things? Like, is people say grief journey, is there an end to it? I mean, but what I've kind of learned is all of this, and then going right into the pandemic
Right.
and being sitting there kind of in solitude, um, is really you grief kind of like just kind of cracks you open to feel everything all at once. And now when I feel all of those feelings, all the prickly feelings, I feel like, um, that's what grief is all of those unexpressed things, all of those anniversaries we won't have and the talks we won't have. That's what grief is. And so it's not something to work through really or push back. It's something I want with me because there are jewels and treasures in that grief. Like it's made me understand loss, like the loss, like a divorce or the loss of a relationship, or the loss of a person in a much different way than what I ever understood before. And I've found that going through this myself has really opened me up to other people, telling me their stories of loss. Um, it's kind of like a comfortable spot if someone knows that you've went through something, so horrific. It makes it easier for them to talk to you about their losses.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned your children. I love their names. Tell everybody your children's names.
So my son is Briar and he's 14, and my daughter is Willow and she's 9.
Wow.
Her name's Willow James. She was named after James Taylor.
Oh, neat.
Yeah.
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 And so, I mean, this, the pandemic, being at home. I mean, how did you all navigate that together, and you continuing your work, and how did it affect your work?
It affected my work, a lot because to begin with, I felt like, "Oh my gosh, we're not gonna have a show this year." So, or I mean, we are this year, but not the pandemic year. And then I thought, "So I should be so productive, and I'm a self-taught artist, so I should learn how to do what I do, like, for real." Like, I should learn the real skills. Um, and then with the kids and grief and homeschooling, I kind of took a step back, and I really, it was a time that enabled us to walk around in our yard and like feel the earth that we own, that we have, and like sink our feet into this this piece of land. And that had its own gifts. And realizing that um you know my journey, creating a childhood for them, a happy childhood, regardless of all the losses we've had, is my primary focus. And still I was creating every day, and I had my hands in the clay, and I was doing it, I was trying, but at the end, not that the pandemic is over, but at the end of that time period, when I put all my work together in a show, I was kind of in awe to see that every piece I created during that time period, their eyes were closed.
Wow.
And that was really kind of a deep uh, thing for me to say, okay, so school's closed. I lost my husband. I lost my mom. I have to teach the kids all by myself at home. We can't go anywhere. We can't do anything. So, like, figuratively, I closed my eyes,
Wow.
I think. And I really tried to sink down into myself and find my purpose during that time. And now I'm really feeling the purpose of my work, in a deeper way. And I completely credit the pandemic and me not being able to get away from my grief. I had to sit right here with it.
And how would you describe that purpose?
I For me, I place a lot of weight on my purpose, with curating the art show. That's very important to me. And my artwork itself, it's important because um, walking through this path of death and dying, and seeing how our society really, like what I was telling you this before, like when I had my children, everybody wanted to be there and be around and hold them and talk about, morning sickness and all this stuff. But then when Joe passed away, only less than a handful of people were there. And um, death was kind of like not a thing that we were going to talk about, or that I didn't know what to do as I sat next to his bedside and helped him through that process. No one had ever talked to me about what to do.
Yeah.
And um, so it's definitely been a process. So I take those things and I put them into the artwork, the feelings of loss, or aloneness, or um, feeling kind of awkward about things, or feeling, left alone or left out. So I kind of view my work as like small talismans that I put out into the world, with stories that help people navigate.
Wow. Wow. I did want to talk a little bit. You really started with pumpkins, and since then you work in a lot of other things. But what is it about pumpkins that enthrall you?
I love the Cinderella coach that turns into a pumpkin. I love that. Um, I just love pumpkins and all of their varieties. And in the fall, I love going to all of the pumpkin farms locally and seeing all the different varieties. Like there's fairy tale pumpkins and Cinderella pumpkins and blue pumpkins. And you know, I really enjoy, like the shape of a pumpkin is beautiful to me. They're completely their own artwork.
Yeah. I just shared a comment about our conversation about grief from
Mhm.
Karen. Grief is deep and real, and I get what you're saying. And Karen just suffered a loss. We all lost Trace Christensen
Mhm.
this past year.
Yes.
Um, yeah, just needed a second. Okay. Um, Yeah, but now you work in a lot of, what else do you work in? I mean, and
So
I should say that you're not actually working with real gourds.
no, I'm hand sculpting. I work in paper mache and clay, and it depends on the size of the piece, really. But I really work in mixed media because I use all vintage things. Like I go to antique places all the time, and I'm finding really inspirational stuff to, like, fill the vessel that is me with inspiration and magic so I can create things. So sometimes they'll have vintage thimbles or little vintage sewing things with them. But yeah, I make witches and pumpkins and the familiars like bats. But one of the characters that I just completely fell in love with along the way was Bigfoot, like, or, little hairy creatures like Bigfoot or Jojo the dog-faced boy, or um, I made a little girl that was like a circus oddity as well. Circus oddities often go along with Halloween stuff, and so I've kind of went in that direction as well.
Yeah, yeah. So before
Uh-oh, where'd you go?
I honestly, I didn't hit anything. I don't know why that it's happened before. But what I wanted to say is before we run out of time, I just want you to talk a little bit about bewitching peddlers of Halloween.
Sure, yeah, um, it's a fabulous undertaking. It's the one of the largest Halloween fine art shows in the Midwest. It's all hand curated, and I have it at Calhoun County Fairgrounds in Marshall, Michigan. And so, really, I invite about 50 of the most magical people I know to gather in this barn at the fairgrounds, and we completely infuse it with magic, and we transform it into this beautiful experience. And, along the way, we've created a community, and it's wonderful. That's where I have all of my work. I only sell it once per year at the show. And so that's where you can find my pieces. But, we have artists from all across the country.
Nice, nice. And so for people who want to it's September 24th, 2020
Mhm.
this year at Calhoun County Fairgrounds. And there is a website, Bewitching Peddlers of Halloween, I believe is the name of the website, right?
It is, yeah. Hmm.
So folks can learn more. Well, I appreciate you so much.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah,
And
it is. We always have good talks.
we do. Yes, we do. And thank you everybody for joining us. But I think we have one more comment here. I always hate it when I miss somebody's comments after when the show ends. There we go. It's the best, says Ellen B. Is that how you say that?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Nice. And Lori Mitchell.
Oh, hi, Lori.
So again, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Uh-huh. And so we do have another program next week. Another Jennie, Jennie DeYoung, who runs the creative space. Some of you loyal watchers of Stories of Sundown will know that we tried several weeks ago to have Jennie on. We had technical issues, but we're going to have her back on. And now we got the public back in the library, and we'll talk about how that space will work. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the snow. Oh.
No.
Have a good night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.